1 Kings chapter 19, verses 9 to 13. And he came thither unto a cave, and lodged there. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. And he said unto him, What dost thou here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts. The children of Israel have forsaken thy covenant, thrown down thine altars, and slain thy prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And he said, Go forth and stand upon the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and broke into pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And it was so, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out, and stood in the entrance of the cave.
It's been a number of years since I first read this story in my pastoral care textbook in the seminary. It's a story of a young, fresh off the press, out of the seminary pastor in his first church. He was only in his early 20s, and he got a call from the secretary saying that there was a man who is quite distraught and angry and fearful, and he is waiting to see a pastor. This young pastor had hoped that the senior pastor would be on hand for such matters, but not today. And so he found himself going toward the man, inviting the man into his office. And before they could even sit down, the man started yelling and screaming and saying, Why? I have been good all my life. I have gone to church on a regular basis. I have raised my children. I have kept the commandments. Why? Why was my son killed this week? And he went on to describe the agony and the pain and the teetering with existential despair and the loss of hope and even loss of faith that he would ever be able to survive the horrific death of his son. The young pastor, to be honest, was frightened. He was frightened at the emotions. He was frightened of the anger. He was frightened at the choice of words that this man was using to describe God. He was also feeling limited and insecure, and his own confidence in God was starting to shake. What do I say? What do I do? I don't remember being prepared in seminary for such matters. And so he sat there, like a deer in the headlights sometimes. But he did sit there. He had enough training and enough sense and enough intelligence not to run from the room, not to call for someone else, to listen to this man. And so he just sat there. And he allowed his own emotions to come and go. And he just sat there. And the man went on for another half hour or so, until the man finally collapsed in tears. And the young pastor just sat there. Fast forward a few days, the man came back to the parsonage, back to the church, to ask to see the young pastor. And the young pastor, as he made his way to see this man yet again for the second time this week, started trembling a bit. He was unsettled all week by the encounter. And yet, somehow deep within him, he trusted that there was a presence greater than himself that was at work in that room. But he still beat himself up all week for not having the right words. And as he entered the meeting room the second time to meet this man who was still very much in grief, the man spoke in a soft voice this time to this young pastor and said, "Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for not giving me all sorts of quick platitudes, like God never sends us what we can't handle, like, oh, somewhere down along the road you will find some of the answers to your questions. You'll make meaning out of this. Thank you. Thank you for just being here. And incidentally, I'd like to check something out with you. Did you sense the presence in the room that shifted me from anger to sobbing?" And the pastor nodded. And they ended the meeting. And I never forgot this story, and I've imagined over the last number of years what that encounter, unprepared as the pastor so thought he was, how that shaped who he was. Reading the story shaped who I was as a pastor and who I am as a pastor. It reminded me of a number of things. Number one, silence is not always empty silence. Sometimes silence is filled with a presence, and we know the difference. Two, God uses us for compassion, for understanding, for forgiveness, for love, for welcoming people in our lives, and for hearing stories. And even when we're off our game, or even if we're too young, or even if we're afraid, or even if we don't have the right words, in the silence, there's a presence that takes over. Not just for pastors, but for mothers, and for fathers, and for spouses, and for teachers, and for doctors, and for nurses, and for bosses. If we develop our inner lives, this divine presence shows up and carries on in spite of us, despite of us, and uses us. And it behooves us to pay attention to this inner life. We all know what it's like to pay attention to our physical beings. We know when we've had too much sugar or ate too much or didn't eat enough. We all know when we've had a little too much wine. We can monitor our physical beings and make adjustments here and there and make commitments and set goals. And if we live those goals and if we practice the disciplines, our physical beings know the difference. Same is true with our emotional lives. We know when we're starting to isolate because we don't dare talk to someone about what's bothering us. We don't want to bother anybody, or we're not sure if we're going to be believed or listened to. But we know when we need to talk more or when we need to talk less. We know how to tend to our emotional lives and our physical lives. And hopefully here on Sunday mornings and how we gather in community throughout the week, we learn that we also have an inner life that we can monitor as well. That we can say, do I leave room for this divine presence within me to take over and to dwell in me and to come out when that presence is needed most? Hopefully, we learn here that there is a power greater than ourselves who will not dupe us, who will not abandon us, who will not leave us alone no matter what our situation may be, no matter what our situation may be. But like our physical lives and like our emotional lives, we don't know what's going on unless we stop and think about it and make some good decisions and bring in some disciplines to help us be healthy and wise and calm. So too with our inner lives. And I think one of the things that that young pastor must have learned that day is that silence is golden. Those of us who are more seasoned in life know this for a fact. Silence is golden sometimes. And much is happening in that silence. And this God in whom we place our trust and move and have our being as we so often pray, never leaves us and is within us as well as outside of us. And we can count on this God to be there when we are not fully there. But it will take some disciplines. We're in a discipline as we speak, attending church, rubbing elbows with others who believe as we do in order to give us the strength and the courage to face whatever we need to face, whether it be joys or sorrows in our lives. And what are the other disciplines that you have? Spiritual readings and Bible study and mission work. These are all disciplines that develop your inner life. One of the strongest and most powerful that we heard in this story, and that I would like to leave with you today during this very brief homily, is that trust the silence and nurture the silence. In the world in which we live, there's not enough time for silence. And so I encourage us this week to simply sit in silence and allow the divine mystery, a power greater than who we are, a presence to be in your silence. And I close this morning saying, if I want you to think about silence and practice silence during the week, then I shouldn't just talk about it. And so I'm going to ask you for the next 2 minutes to simply sit in silence. And the challenge is not to think about anything, not to plan anything, not to worry about anything, but to simply sit in the presence of the beloved and know that you are not alone and that you are loved and that somebody has your back, no matter how you're feeling today. What helps me to center and without thinking is when I ring this Tibetan bell. And so for those of you who think all the time as I do, listen to the bell and let it go deep inside of you until you have no thoughts at all. I often turn to poetry to make my point, and Mary Oliver is one of my favorite poets. And she has a poem on praying, and it's this: Praying by Mary Oliver. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It can be weeds in an empty lot, or a few small stones. Just patch a few words together, and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest. But praying is a gateway, a doorway into thanks and silence in order that another voice may speak.